Campbell, we are talking again. You are the man. So good to see you.
I can't see your eyes. Never trust a man with sunglasses.
Well, I'm outside.
Or a beard.
I'm outside because it is Southern California, and it just rained yesterday, and it is so sensationally gorgeous with big puffy clouds and perfect weather and no bugs like there are in Georgia, biting you all the time. And, because we're cool here, we have to wear sunglasses. It's just the way it is, okay? So live with it. So we're with Sergio Kajfal again. This is great. Pastor of Seventh-day Adventist Church in Northridge, California. What?
The California sun is unbearable.
It's unbearable to you.
I said the California sun is unbearable.
It's unbearable that it exists. That's your problem, Yeah. I know you'd rather be here, so zip it. All right. Travis, you said you had something really important you wanted to talk to Sergio about. We're talking about Seventh-day Adventism and the differences between, what do you want to call it, Reformed Protestant theology and Protestant theology in general, and Seventh-day Adventism, and I'm learning a lot. This is really a lot of fun. So, Sergio, thank you again for joining us. And Travis, you had a question you said was important, so let's see if it is.
Well, this is an area that I don't know much about, and it's the life and teachings of Ellen White, who was the main founder of Seventh-day Adventism, as I understand the movement. So I was just wondering if you could just tell us about her and why she means so much to the movement and what her contributions were, and at least generally what her reviews were. So that's a tall order, but if you could just give us some info on her, I think the audience would benefit from it.
And how she fits into your theology now.
Sure, absolutely. So, just to give a very brief overview, I'm not an Ellen White historian, but I can just give you some brief things. She was born in the 1820s. As Travis, as you mentioned, she is. I would call her one of our co-founders. There are really three people that really helped to build up the Adventist Church. Ellen White, James White, her husband, and then Joseph Bates, who was this, used to be a sailor, swearing, drinking, doing all the normal stuff. And one day he had a conversion experience. And so he was much older than James White and Ellen White when the Adventist Church really began to form. James and Ellen White were in their teens, basically. I think Ellen White was about 18 years old when, from 1844 and on. But one of the things that Ellen White did early on for us as Seventh-day Adventists, the Adventist Church in general, we affirm her prophetic ministry, especially in terms of the guiding, correcting, rebuking of the church. Oftentimes when we think about prophets, we typically are thinking about people who are foreseeing the future. And certainly we would say that Ellen White did some of that. But if you read through the Old Testament, a lot of the work of the prophets was to correct, rebuke, guide. You read, for example, the book of Isaiah, the book of Nahum. You read the book of Jonah, all of these prophets that are really helping to guide and lead the church, leading Israel. And so we see that a lot of Ellen White's work was part of that. So, for example, there in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, we had a kind of a conference, if you will, of all these major leaders in 1888, and we call it the Conference of Righteousness by Faith, the Minneapolis Conference in 1888. And it was a challenge because many Seventh-day Adventists, we had gained we thought with this renewed interest in the Ten Commandments, particularly in the commandment of the Sabbath. However, there were many Seventh-day Adventists who, although the movement had only formally existed for about 20 years, that they were preaching so much the Ten Commandments that basically they were moving in this direction of salvation by works. And so we had these two young theologians from California, out in this beautiful sun, as Ross was mentioning, and they came and they were these, just completely different voices saying, no, there is such a thing as righteousness by faith. We are saved by the grace of Jesus. And quite a few of these older guard, even at the time, the president of the Seventh-day Adventist Church just thought, no, this is not right. We need to be emphasizing the commandments. We need, otherwise you're diluting the commandments. And as far as I know, Ellen White's role was somewhat reserved, but she began in some of her letters to support, this message of righteousness by faith. And so, and this was so alarming, so hurtful to some of these leaders that the president of the Seventh-day Adventist Church of the time, G.I. Butler, he quit his job. He quit the presidency because he thought Ellen White was siding with these theologians, and in many ways she was. And so there was a lot of correcting and guidance, that was needing to take place in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And oftentimes what would happen is there would be studies, Bible studies that people would do, and groups of people would be there, and they would come to a conclusion on Scripture. And on occasion, she would have a vision that would confirm the study. There's a very interesting story that one of the early Adventist review editors, it's a journal for the Adventist Church, his name was Uriah Smith, and he tells this story of some people that are accusing the Adventist Church of following Ellen White and deriving our teachings from Ellen White. And he points out this incredible story that there was a time when they were studying and asking, we believe in the seventh-day Sabbath, and on Saturday being Sabbath, but when should we start keeping the Sabbath? And so, they begin to study, and they have different perspectives. There are two perspectives that really arise. Either Saturday starts at sunset, or it starts at 6:00 p.m. Don't tell me why that was the reason. I just, that's kind of how it was there. And they tell this story, and they're studying, and they're going back and forth. And Ellen White receives this vision in which an angel tells her, from even to even, you keep the Sabbath. And so she thought even, meaning 6 p.m. Therefore, that's the vision that needs to be, that's what needs to be, done and taught. And so she tells everybody, oh, this is it. This is right. And, people start believing her, except for a few who begin to say, I don't think that's what the Scripture teaches. And Uriah Smith tells this story that there are these other theologians in the Adventist Church that begin to study the issue and go, no, I don't think so. I think it's from sunset to sunset. You read, for example, in Genesis, from evening to morning, and you see this kind of, you see that pattern in Scripture. Well, eventually everybody else is convinced, except for a few people, and Ellen White herself, who says, there's no way, I did not get the vision wrong. And so finally she receives the vision again, but she receives this clarity that it is from sunset to sunset. And, and so Uriah Smith takes that story to say, on occasion, Ellen White might receive a vision from God, but she is also an interpreter of those things. And so we as Adventists have taken great painstaking care and caution to be as faithful to the Scriptures as possible. And where Ellen White might have some maybe expounding upon, or may have a role in confirming some of the things that we've already believed through the study of Scripture. So that's why, for me at least, and I think a couple of episodes back I mentioned this in the beginning, that for us, the primary authority, the primary authority is Scripture. Now, everybody else outside of that has a secondary role, but only in relationship to, or subject to, or in submission to Scripture. And so she was very helpful in encouraging, rebuking some church leaders, really helping to form and shape the Seventh-day Adventist Church. But for us as Seventh-day Adventists, we see her as kind of really, subject to Scripture, as she herself stated many, many times.
So in our tradition, like take the Reformed tradition, we will take a theologian like a Calvin or a B.B. Warfield or somebody like that, and hold them in very high esteem. But because they are in no way inspired, nor are they prophets,
Sure.
we're certainly not going to put them on the same status as Scripture.
Yes.
It seems to me that if I'm understanding you correctly, Seventh-day Adventists would have kind of a third tier or a second tier. So your theologians would be sort of where we put a Warfield or a Calvin. Then the Scripture is the highest authority, but between those two would be a prophetess like Ellen White. Is that a correct way
Yeah,
of understanding things?
I would probably say that that's fair. Yeah. She, for us, she certainly is an authority, but it's not the kind of authority where when she says something, boom, that's what we have to do. Rather, we are constantly going back to Scripture and asking the question, how does this truly align with Scripture? And that's one of the things that she mentioned. She has this quote that many Adventists will often quote her for, that I am the lesser light leading to the greater light. And in her context, it was Jesus. And so for her, she is always the Scriptures, Christ, those are the things that must be uplifted up. She is only support and encouragement to come back to the Scriptures and to read the Scriptures more. So in many ways, for us, to read Ellen White is to read somebody who not only had inspiration from God, but also was somebody that acknowledged, recognized, and encouraged us to submit to the authority of canon.
Wow. Okay. Sergio, if there is, I want to stay on that subject though.
Sure.
Travis, you asked something. I got 50 thoughts and I don't know where to go with it.
Well, it does take us back to the full circle to the question I asked in our last episode about the degrees of inspiration and whether inspiration is different in kind or degree. And it seems I am still kind of confused if she's inspired, but it's not the same as Scripture. I just don't know how that works. So I have a clear distinction between saying William Shakespeare is inspired and the Scripture is inspired, because it's a different in kind. I don't know how that third category fits into your authority structure.
And let me say something on that too, especially since you guys, the Seventh-day Adventists, don't agree with everything Ellen White taught, correct?
Right.
Well, that's quite a pickle there. I mean, I would say, how might I say this? There are some Seventh-day Adventists that would, not consider her a prophet. They would say that but I don't think that that's the majority. I don't know that, but I don't think that's the majority. We do believe that there are things that she taught where she tells us very clearly she was not. Let me not say taught. She was not always in the mode of inspiration. So there are things that she might say where, she's writing. For example, we have her letters to her husband where she's talking about, I miss you. And, I miss, snuggling up to you or whatever, or something like that. There are some things that she says where, there's nothing necessarily where she's indicating that she's inspired. There's even a story of a man who writes a letter to her and says, Ellen White, you talked about building this sanitarium, this place for healing, for medical healing and so forth, and back in those days. And you said, I'm just going to make a number, that it was 66 rooms in this letter, and you said 65 in another. Well, which one is it? Aren't you inspired? And she says, well, brother, God didn't tell me what number of rooms I should be putting. So there are certain things that she says where she's not inspired, and part of it is acknowledging and recognizing, when that sense of inspiration certainly hit her. Yeah.
Would that be similar then to the Catholics who say that the Pope speaks ex cathedra, and in those times that he does, it's infallible, and the rest of the time he's just being a human being?
Oh, that's such a good question. I want to be careful here because I'm certainly not an expert on ex cathedra. So it's my understanding, right, that as you're mentioning that, when he sits on that chair, he is infallible. He's speaking something that has authority over the church. But I think for us as Seventh-day Adventists, while we believe that certainly Ellen White had this process of inspiration, I think we would also say that Ellen White is not exhaustive. We would be careful to point out that she is not the final word on Scripture. There are some things that she might say or that she might teach that might bring us into a very special awareness about Scripture, but that doesn't mean that what she says is the end of knowledge about Scripture. There is still more to uncover. I mean, she lived in the 1800s, lived all the way up until 1915. We've had so many advances in biblical theological studies that I think it's important to recognize that God certainly is always revealing truth. And for us, Ellen White doesn't even necessarily need to be the last prophet. That's why I think our doctrine of prophecy is very broad, in the sense that we want to acknowledge God can certainly bring up other prophets. Now, to Travis's point, we still want, that's why part of the reason why I mentioned non-canonical is we still make a distinction between non-canonical prophets and then those prophets that are part of the canon, or those writers that are part of the canon. Their authority is the highest authority. Now, certainly we have other people, you think about the prophets in the New Testament, for example, that were there. Their writings are not a part of us. And I think it brings up, again, that broad question of canon, right? If, for example, if we were to find the writings of one of those prophets in the New Testament, that helped form the early church, what would we do with those writings? And I'm not saying you don't have an answer, but I think from the Adventist perspective, we would be clear in saying, well, Scripture is the authority. The Bible does clearly reveal this kind of closed canon, and God has chosen these prophets to be the authority of Scripture. Now, there can be other people that are inspired, and that can be prophets outside of the canon of Scripture, but they do not have the same sense of authority. Yeah.
Very good. I have a question is Travis, do you have anything more on Ellen White? I have a related question. Okay. Sergio, this is one of the questions you and I talked about off the air a couple of weeks ago that I wanted to ask you, and that is the failed prophecy that happened in 1844. You guys, what do you call that? The
Great Disappointment. Yeah.
The Great Disappointment. I just think that's such an honest way to address it. And I think it's really noteworthy that happened, and the whole movement didn't just fall apart. I mean, think about all the people in the past that have claimed a vision or an inspiration, and it doesn't happen, and they just become losers or pariah. They're written off in history, and yet, the Great Disappointment, you guys are honest about it and you label it as what it was, and yet it didn't kill the movement. Can you just talk about maybe why that was and how that was different than other times in history where something like that would have happened and we wouldn't even be talking about it now?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I mentioned this partially at the beginning, but part of the Adventist understanding, we come out of the Millerite movement, although we are not, you might call us maybe partially the successors of the Millerites, but we certainly branch off and go in a different direction. For us, part of what William Miller was trying to ascertain was, this verse in Daniel 8, verse 14, there shall be 2,300 evenings and mornings, and then the sanctuary shall be cleansed or shall be reconsecrated, as some translations say. It's that verb in Hebrew, sadak, which means to be righteous. But it's, if I recall, it's one of the only times that word righteous is made in a passive form. So it's a very unique verse. And William Miller thought that the sanctuary that was to be cleansed was the earth. And so using this kind of procedure, if you will, this biblical procedure called the day-year principle, you find this, for example, in the book of Numbers and the book of Ezekiel, where one day means 1 year. And so William Miller takes this and goes, well, there's 2,300 evenings and mornings. He goes through his, looking at you see Daniel chapter 8 and Daniel chapter 9 are both deeply interlinked. And he goes, okay, well, I think it's going to be about, initially he says around the year 1843, 1842, and then finally lands on 1844. And he says, well, if the earth is going to be cleansed, that means Jesus is coming back. So let's do it. And, everybody, sells their land, their farms, and Jesus doesn't come back. And so there was a group of Seventh-day Adventists that are, they were those Millerites at the time, who begin to study and say, what did Miller get wrong? I mean, it seemed like it was on point, but what is it that he gets wrong? Now, this is one of the more, I would say, unique contributions to Christianity is our doctrine of the sanctuary. And it comes out of this understanding that, what's beginning the process of this of this cleansing, of this making righteous again, is not the earth, and it's not the earthly sanctuary, which is no longer existent, but rather we as Seventh-day Adventists make the claim, and starting from that early Bible study, that there is a heavenly sanctuary. And so just as Jesus dies on the cross, and it's a kind of typology of the sacrifice of the lamb, of the daily sacrifice, there is, from the perspective of Adventists, a kind of Day of Atonement, a Yom Kippur, as Jewish people would say, that begins for us in 1844, and it is if you will, a kind of cleansing of the sanctuary, but rather it is a cleansing, or how might I say this? A transparency of God's judgments. Now, that's this doctrine, the doctrine of the sanctuary, or Christ's ministry in the heavenly sanctuary, is a fairly lofty doctrine. There's a couple of premises. But for us, what comes out of that is this understanding that at the end of time, for us, we are premillennials. So Jesus comes before the 1,000 years. But what happens for us during the 1,000 years is that all this time, Jesus has been preparing the transparency of God's judgment. And so when we are, if you might call this heaven, when we are in heaven, we are actually overseeing the judgments of God himself. And so God is making transparent what it is that he has judged, how he has judged. And we take our time in asking those questions to God himself. And so for us, part of that doctrine is that Jesus is, in a sense, preparing those records for us, ministering in the heavenly sanctuary. Of course, continually ministering the benefits of his atonement at the same time. So you might see why a philosophy of time is somewhat pertinent to our doctrine, because it requires a different way of thinking about things. But that's part of the tie-in for us as Seventh-day Adventists, is that God, for us, the emphasis of theology is the character of God. And so what we see is that God, within the Arminian tradition, God preserves the free will of people by allowing them to see and take a look and in a sense, judge God's judgments, and to see in the end that God truly was fair, that he was just, he was kind. We would augment that with other verses. For example, you read in the book of Ecclesiastes and several other places, that all deeds, good and bad, will be judged. Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, but do you not know that we will judge too? Speaking against, the Christians who are suing each other. So that's kind of the doctrine that kind of comes out of that. And that's what kind of makes it a little bit more unique, is this very different way in which, I shouldn't say very different way, but a different kind of perspective by which God is able to administer his justice, but also ensure that the free will of people are intact by allowing them to see for themselves how God judged everyone, and coming to the conclusion eventually that God truly was just, kind, merciful, and good.
I was watching a video a few years ago, and the individual was very, all of his interpretation, he was interpreting prophecy and making speculations about the end times. And all of his interpretations were heavily influenced by a kind of numerology, where the year stands for a day or vice versa.
Sure.
And it turned out that this individual was a Seventh-day Adventist.
Oh.
And that made me wonder if, I mean, like there are some segments in evangelicalism where they really spend all of their time speculating about the end of time,
Yep.
the last days. You may be familiar with dispensationalism, which is people have linked it to those Second Great Awakening movements like the Millerites that came out of the 20s, 30s, and 40s.
Sure.
So is that still, I mean, is that individual that I saw, whose name I cannot remember, would he be an outlier in terms of that kind of speculation, or is that a very still vibrant kind of tradition within Seventh-day Adventism?
Man, that's quite a nerve for us Seventh-day Adventists. You've touched on the pulse there. That's so I think it depends from whose perspective you're talking about. I think from our perspective, we are very clear, at least officially in terms of our teaching, that we don't know when Jesus will come back. Even for example, with that 2300-day prophecy, let's just say, and I've talked with people about this. Let's just say that Jesus begins ministering, enters a different phase of his ministry in the heavenly sanctuary in 1844. In some ways, it's a very arbitrary year. Why 1844? Was there some kind of great fire that came down from heaven? Was there? No, I mean, it's just, at least if we are correct in that assumption, only God really knows why those things happen. But we don't know when Jesus will come back. The things we do know are that the gospel must be preached throughout the whole world. We see that much, at least from the perspective of Adventists. We interpret Jesus saying, or Jesus is saying that, he won't come back until the gospel has been preached. And of course, there's a whole rabbit hole we could go down about that as well. But, so we are, I think we as Adventists acknowledge that there are limitations in terms of, at least officially, we acknowledge limitations in terms of what we can know. We certainly cannot predict when Jesus will come back. Now, there are individuals with the Seventh-day Adventist Church that we call them independent ministries. I don't know if it's the same name for you guys, but they go off on all kinds of rabbit holes. I mean, there's a couple of people, who have come out. There was some guy in South America who said, in 3.5 years, this is going to happen and that's going to happen. We've had people, say, Jesus is coming back in this year and that year. And I think generally as Seventh-day Adventists, we would distance ourselves from those kinds of people because Scripture has not revealed many of those things that they're speaking about, or certainly, contradicts some of the things that they're saying. I would say that because the Seventh-day Adventist understanding of eschatology, the study of last days is, I don't want to say that it's greater than, but it's very developed. And we have a very kind of a slightly more rigid form of how we understand eschatology. So because of that emphasis, I think that there are some people.
Well,
Go ahead.
Let me ask you this, because we are getting low on time.
Sure.
What there are, as most people know, three basic views on eschatology: the pre-mill view, the post-mill view, the on-mill view. I take it that the Seventh-day Adventists are premillennial.
Correct. Yeah.
In their approach, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and do they have at least a segment? I would imagine. I think that's in the creedal statements of the Seventh-day Adventist churches. Do they have anything like a pre-tribulational rapture that you find among a lot of evangelicals?
Well, when you guys we don't use the word rapture, but I think when you mean rapture is like, there's going to be pre-tribulation rapture is kind of more like there's all these terrible things that will happen at the end of time, but God's people are saved before that, right? So for us, we would say no. There are, I guess I would say it's a post-tribulation. So God's people go through it with us. You see in the book of Revelation, there is a remnant. There are people who are faithful to Jesus and faithful to keeping his commandments. We see that as part of the trajectory of Scripture. God preserves his people through a lot of difficulty. I mean, there is, that's what we see in Revelation. And the world comes to an end when Christ comes down and brings his people and resurrects the righteous dead and takes with him the living, the righteous living. So that's how we see it. Yeah.
Well, that's a good way to end. We've ended with the end times. Sergio, thank you for helping us with Seventh-day Adventism, and maybe we can have you on later just about general theological issues or politics or apologetical issues. But this has been a treat, and I want to thank you so much for the time you spent with us.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Sergio. All right. Well, we'll see you all next week.